Time for another edition of the Blue-White Breakdown, PennLive's Penn State football podcast. It's a daily podcast. I'm Bob Flounders, joined by Greg Pickel, who is furiously drinking water, I believe, to get his Tuesday restarted. Just heard from James Franklin and his Tuesday news conference. Just remember, guys, that we have on a podcast every day, whether it's Greg and I, Dave Jones and I, or Dustin Hockensmith doing some stuff in the morning. You can always catch the latest up-to-date Penn State football news in season on the Blue-White Breakdown. Greg Pickel, you look fantastic on this Tuesday. We're in December. Hard to believe it. Feels like only a couple weeks ago, it was like 75 degrees out and shorts weather, outside stuff, and it's definitely not 75 degrees today, Greg. But let's talk about the press conference. Let's talk about James Franklin's thoughts. It's Rutgers week. Penn State's dominated Rutgers pretty good over the course of the series. I think they're like 28-2 or something like that. It's going to be a noon kick in Piscataway. We made fun of the betting line last week, Greg, and we paid dearly for it. We didn't understand it, and Penn State pretty much won that game handily against Michigan 27-17. Lo and behold, Penn State is a 10-point favorite at Rutgers. Rutgers has 2 wins, which is double the amount of wins that Penn State has. They just won at Purdue. But James Franklin, let's get to it. It's not a big deal, but let's start with some injury news. We are podcasting from Harrisburg. There's a local player on the Penn State roster. He was hoping to be a key reserve linebacker, Charlie Catcher, but we've seen less and less of him, Greg, and more of a freshman named Curtis Jacobs. I think we found out why on Tuesday.
Yeah, James Franklin revealing that Charlie Catcher did suffer a season-ending injury. The last time he suited up, Bob, was the Nebraska game. So Joe Herman did have some photos on the field of him on the field prior to, I think it was the Michigan game. So I'm not sure when this happened or what led to it. But yeah, Catcher out for the year now. Disappointing because he was playing probably as much as he ever has in blue and white on defense. He had earned some special teams reps in prior seasons, but now as a redshirt sophomore, he was working in more consistently with Brent Pry's unit. Unfortunately, that's no longer going to be the case this year. We'll see what he can build on next year. But Bob, it's just, and I know that, the impact of Charlie Catcher being out for the year is not the same as Journey Brown or Noah Kane or Micah Parsons. Obviously, that was an opt-out, or Pat Fryermuth, who had season-ending surgery. But, they had 3 corners available against Michigan, obviously. They had 3 corners available there. There's some guys who we have not seen make the trip that usually make the trip, or guys to make the trip and go through warm-ups and then do not play, even though they're on the sideline in pads. Bob, it just feels like there are more guys banged up this year than ever before in a James Franklin-led season. I guess part of that's probably just pandemic related and missing a lot of the time in the offseason, but I don't know if it's bad luck or what, but they certainly are rarely completely healthy, it seems, each week.
Yeah, and you mentioned corners. I know you asked James about the 3 corners. The 3 corners that played against the Wolverines, Marquise Wilson started, Joey Porter Jr. started, and they were using Daquan Hardy as the 3rd corner. That meant that for the 3rd straight game, they didn't have Tariq Castro-Fields. Not a lot of clarity with regard to his status. He looks good in warmups when we get a chance to see him at times. Didn't have him. And Keaton Ellis, another mystery disappearance. 2 players I think that are pretty good players on that defense. And I didn't get a set. I guess James said that they're hoping they'll have a 4th corner available for Rutgers and possibly a 5th, but he couldn't have been more vague. So what is your read on Penn State's corner situation? And can Penn State get away with playing 3 corners 2 weeks in a row?
It's going to be really challenging unless they move Lamont Wade into more of a corner role, or they move one of these other safeties into more of a corner role. It's almost miraculous that they got away with it at Michigan. I mean, that kind of tells you how bad this Michigan offense is, if you didn't think that after watching them. But yeah, I mean, Tariq Castro-Fields and Keaton Ellis, both guys look like they're going to be able to play before the game based on what we can see in warmups. And then, there's been times, especially with Castro-Fields, where that just isn't the case. So not sure what's going on there. He made it sound like, again, they feel pretty good about getting one of those guys back without saying who, and they hope they can get both of them back. So we'll see. Ellis didn't play a lot this season until Nebraska, and then a couple of games later he's out again. So not sure what's going on there. Time will tell. But yeah, I mean, Rutgers has its own issues with injuries. Its starting quarterback is hurt. They played Stikowski and Langdon, I believe his name is, during the win at Purdue. So we'll see if they're full strength. But yeah, it could be a less than full strength Rutgers passing attack versus a less than full strength Penn State secondary on Saturday in Piscataway. Just another storyline that we'll have to keep in mind here, Bob, as kickoff nears.
Yeah, and I just want to point out one possibility no longer exists. Trent Gordon, who they moved from corner to safety this offseason, I believe is in the transfer portal. He hadn't played at all at safety, which was a little bit of a head scratcher. But he played corner last year for Penn State in a reserve role. But that is now no longer an option for James Franklin, Brent Pry, and the rest of the defensive coaches. It's unfortunate. Greg, we're into week 7. Penn State's 1-5. And in a normal year, usually there's a couple of Penn State players by now that have either been named Penn State Big Ten Offensive Player of the Week or Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. I don't think they've had that this year, which speaks to the fact that they just won their first game. But, Greg, they did have the Big Ten Freshman of the Week this week in Kevon Lee, their 230-pounder, who is, technically, I think he's their fourth option now when you talk about no Jody Brown, now no Noah Kane. Devin Ford, who we'll get to a little bit later, unavailable for the Michigan game. So they turned to Lee. They used Keziah Holmes. I think he had 10 carries. They ran their quarterbacks, both quarterbacks ran for touchdowns. Sean Clifford started. Will Levis was like a short yardage guy who made some plays. But, James was asked about Kevon Lee. He's kind of quickly becoming a fan favorite in a season where they've only won once in 6 games. I can understand that. James talked about his size. He talked about his vision. He also said one of the things that gets overlooked is, he's a guy that always falls forward. And, he even if there's no hole there, he still finds a way to make a yard or two. And he said that adds up during the course of the game. What did you think about Kevon Lee against Michigan? And should we expect another 20-carry game from him, 20-plus carry game against those Scarlet Knights?
Well, I think that Penn State's best game plan is going to be to do more running, Bob, and less putting Sean Clifford in bad spots where he has to throw the ball a lot. I think that was by far the most important reason why Penn State did not suffer any turnovers in the win at Michigan. But yeah, James Franklin did say Devin Ford is back with the team. He had a death in the family that took him away from the Lions last week. So they got him back. I believe James said he came back on Sunday. So he's back with the team now. Apparently went through all the COVID stuff and everything's fine there. So we'll see how much of a role Devin Ford has now this week. I would expect he'll take some carries away from Lee and from Keziah Holmes. So maybe not another 20 carry effort from Lee, but I could see 10, 12 for sure, maybe even 14 or 15. I just think that they have to be willing to go with the guy that can get them there. And last week that was Kevon Lee. So if they feel like that was not just a product of the offensive line getting good push against a bad Michigan front, but that Lee was kind of making plays that maybe weren't there and wouldn't be there for somebody else, then I think they got to keep rolling with him. So we'll see what they decide to do, Bob. I do think, though, it feels like that when they use him, the run game just has a little bit more of a spark to it and a little bit more of a push than what it does when the other guys are in.
Absolutely. Let's just circle back to Devin Ford. You mentioned a death in the family, but Greg, he also left the Iowa game with an injury, an undisclosed injury, I think, on the first series. I'm just wondering if he is over that. I think it's he left the team, so there was a COVID issue, but also I don't know if he was going to be healthy. I think last week James said they weren't quite sure if they were going to have him available, and maybe he was referring to something other than the injury. But I think there's just a couple of things probably in the way of maybe Devin Ford returning to play. Hopefully he will return to play, Greg. And Kevon Lee, this was. The Michigan game, this wasn't really, the first time we said everyone kind of said, whoa, this guy can play. He had that long touchdown run at Nebraska. Even in the Iowa game, he did some good things. He's able to catch the ball, which is important. Both Keziah Holmes and Kevon, they're going to play as long as they can also block in the pass game, because at some point, Greg, they are going to have to throw the ball a little bit. Greg, you mentioned Sean Clifford not turning the ball over. Neither did Will Levis. But Greg, there's still one throw from the Michigan game that has Penn State fans in a bit of a tizzy, and it was a spike. It was a spike when Penn State, I think there was, inside of a minute to go in the first half. Penn State's up 14-7. They recover a fumble. Drew Hartlaub gets a fumble. They get inside. They get a 1st and goal, Greg, at the Michigan 5. They have a timeout left. Penn State spikes the ball on 1st down. I think they threw an end zone fade that had absolutely no chance of working. And I think on 3rd down, it wasn't an end zone fade, but it ended up with Sean Clifford just sailing the ball out of bounds. A very empty, unsatisfying possession, given the fact that they had a timeout left. They kicked the field goal. It didn't come back to bite him in the butt. But James Franklin was asked by Audrey Snyder of The Athletic, a noted Green Bay Packers fan, a former PennLive employee, and a darn good reporter. Audrey Snyder asked him about the end zone fades, the red zone offense, kind of what happened there, and how he kind of sees, maybe some of the issues they've had in the red zone. They had 2 really disappointing red zone drives late at Nebraska as well that, they ended up turning over on downs. Your thoughts on what James had to say?
Well, he said the spike came from the sideline, Bob, which I think we could have all assumed. The question we'll have to ask Kirk Ciarrocca when he speaks with the Penn State media on Thursday is, was that his call or was that James Franklin's call? Because I think that'll tell you a lot about why the red zone issues are happening and kind of how that power balance works between James Franklin, who obviously was once an offensive coordinator and a guy who probably has his hands on the offense as the head coach, and of course Kirk Ciarrocca, who they brought in to fix the problems that ailed their offenses over the last couple of years. So I think that'll be fascinating to hear. But as for the fades, he mentioned that they've had success with those in practice during the lead up to the season and then during camp. And I guess my thought process would be that, if they've been without some of these corners for a while, yeah, I can see why they would have success with those against maybe some guys who are not as experienced playing corner or some guys further down the depth chart. But he did say it, and we'll see if it actually comes to fruition. But the word he used, I believe, was we need more variety in the red zone. And I think diversity, that's what it was. Yes. We need more diversity in the red zone. I don't think you'll find anyone who's going to argue with you about that. It looks like they get down there and whatever they were doing to get there kind of just completely goes by the wayside, and it reverts back to about 2 or 3 different plays. So I think diversity is what they need down there, and they can get rid of the fades anytime now, Bob.
Yeah, and I think another problem is I just think Penn State's offensive coaching staff, I would like them just to be a little bit more aware of their personnel in the passing game. Other than the Ohio State game when Jahan Dotson just really he was a magician on some contested catches against Sean Wade, and he caught, I think, 3 touchdowns, 8 catches, 144 yards. I think he had one against Iowa as well. But I just don't know if their receivers are built to win a lot of 50-50 balls or those fades. It's not like they have, Pat Fryermuth's out. They don't have Mike Gesicki. They don't have Chris Godwin. I just think that they're not the biggest receiving group that Penn State's ever had. Jahan Dotson is a very good receiver, but he's not necessarily a guy that's just going to win 50-50 balls all the time. He's not the biggest player. Parker Washington had a great game, 9 catches, I think, for 93 yards, but he's a slot guy that's, he's a little on the short side, quite frankly, a talented player, but that's not his specialty either, Greg. And Fryermuth, I just wonder, do they really have the skill, the weaponry to run those routes in the red zone, to win those 50-50 balls? Might they be better served, playing to the strengths of the receivers that they have?
Yeah, it almost feels like at times, Bob, that they want, like, how Kirk Ciarrocca, when he got here, said it was going to be a mixture of what Penn State did well and what Minnesota did well. It feels like that they're trying to do this like mix mash at times of things that may have worked well at Minnesota or may have worked well at Penn State, and not really playing to your point, the strength of their team and the strength of the players they have right now without Journey Brown, without Noah Cain, without Pat Fryermuth. So yeah, I agree with you. I think there's some ways they can get these guys involved in ways that make more sense. But I also wonder too if there's not an element of it that, a guy like Isaac Lutz gets involved because maybe in practice he's the one doing all the little things right. And maybe they aren't getting enough of the little things right in practice. And that's why they're not using some of these guys the way we envisioned it. I don't know. It's just a speculation, but there has to be some reason Isaac Lutz, a guy who was a walk-on, was involved more than some of the higher recruited guys that are at this position group. So I think that bears worth watching too. But, between Dotson, Parker Washington, I mean, they have a start of some playmakers there. But you're right. There's probably a better way they can use those guys moving forward.
Yeah, and I think we should also mention that, before the season started, maybe coming out of spring, I know they didn't have spring practice, but I know you and I constantly talked about, boy, we're really excited to see what John Dunmore can do as a receiver. TJ Jones was atop the depth chart for the spring that never was. And, John Dunmore left the team before the season started. I believe he's back in Florida. A very highly recruited kid who everyone wanted in the South. I was excited to see him. They don't have him. TJ Jones, I think, made an appearance early in the season for one game. We haven't really seen him since, and it doesn't seem like they're in a hurry to go back to him. A lot of talk about Cam Sullivan-Brown, I think, before the first game, and for whatever reason, that hasn't come to pass. They're really just a two receiver offense, and it's Parker and it's Jahan Dotson, and now we saw a little bit of Lutz, but we're not seeing Keandre Lambert-Smith. We're not seeing some of those other guys that we had heard, and you just wonder kind of what's going on. We don't know about their health. We don't know about maybe if they're not doing things that the new receivers coach Taylor Stubblefield wants to see from them, but it just really hasn't developed into the passing game that maybe we anticipated because of a variety of circumstances. And when there's only a couple games left, Greg, you have to think that nothing is really going to change, I think, in the remainder of the regular season. And if they ever play that Champions Week game against somebody from the Big Ten West, we'll just have to see. But it just seems like it's a two receiver show, and that's what they're gonna ride the horses they trust, and it's going to be Parker and it's going to be Jahan Dotson. Greg, I wanted to ask you one thing. Before I ask you this one thing, though, I know that we're halfway through this podcast and I'm rambling, but it's the Blue-White Breakdown with Bob Flounders and Greg Pickel. And Greg, just tell the listeners, once I shut up, what they could do, where they could go to see this, to listen to it, and how they can kind of review and rate us.
Yeah, Bob, they can find the Blue-White Breakdown, both the daily installments from Dustin Hockensmith and the extended versions from you, Dave Jones, and I, wherever they find their audio, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere else that podcasts are found. You can find the Blue-White Breakdown, and we're also on YouTube at youtube.com/allpennstate. That's where the video version goes. So what do you got for me?
Yeah, so I hate to be a little bit. I'm just wondering about this Michigan game. And yes, Penn State won 27-17. The defense held Michigan under 300 yards. Michigan converted, I think, just 4 of 12 third downs. They were 1 of 3 on fourth down. James talked about the grit that they showed. And obviously, when you win at Michigan and you're Penn State, it's a big deal. They hadn't won there since 2009. But Greg, I'm just going to say this. Did Penn State catch a break when Cade McNamara hurt his shoulder and his collarbone on that first half touchdown drive? Because it sure looked like that Michigan passing game that you saw them make a lot of plays against Rutgers, but it was Rutgers. It just didn't look like there wasn't much oomph in that Michigan passing game, and it didn't really look like McNamara could really kind of stretch the field against a Penn State secondary that only had 3 corners. They tried Joe Milton, but he had plenty of chances earlier this year and had not looked great anyway. Are we making too much of the step forward the Penn State defense took because of the quarterback play at Michigan, or should we just give them credit for getting off the field and holding Michigan under 300 yards?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's you can have a balance, right? I mean, I think that you can on one hand say that this defense played probably one of the better games, and did so while it was shorthanded. I think you can also say that, oh man, was that Michigan offense bad, and you have to make that a part of the story. I don't think there's any question, but this is not the first bad offense Penn State has faced this year, and to its credit, unlike in the past, it did not make an opposing quarterback who was not an All-American look like an All-American for extended stretches. So I think, there is something to be said about that, especially playing down three corners. Or down with only three corners, down a couple of guys due to injury and everything else. So yeah, I do think that Cade McNamara, if healthy, would have probably tested this group a little bit more. There's no doubt. But, it ultimately, again, we've seen Penn State play some guys and play some offenses that are not great, and they weren't able to stop those guys. So the fact that they were able to stop this version of not great, I think you have to count it as a step in the right direction.
Yeah. So let's move the conversation a little bit to a look ahead this year. So they started 0-5. They got their first win. They're 1-5. Greg, is there a path? And would Penn State fans get excited about this? Do you think if they could somehow there might be a path, Greg, that they could get to 500? It seems like a long shot, and it almost seems like an impossibility. But if they would beat Rutgers, if they would close the regular season at home with their first home win against Michigan State, that would get them to 3-5. Excuse me. They are supposed to be playing a Champions Week game against a team from the Big Ten West. I don't know if that is still in play. That would be a 9th game. And Greg, I think college football and the NCAA came out at the start of this COVID pandemic season and said there isn't, to qualify for a bowl game, I don't necessarily think you have to have a winning record. So Greg, if Penn State is sitting there at 4-5, and there's a bowl game out there that wants him, A, should Penn State accept? And B, if they get to 5-5 and rattle off 5 wins in a row, how does that maybe change the look of this season? I'm not trying to get ahead of ourselves. I just think they're going to be favored probably in the last 2 or 3 games they play for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately one question that has not been answered yet, but so there's no win qualification or win limit, whatever, however you want to put it in terms of getting to a bowl game. So is everyone going to be allowed to practice whether they get in or not? I mean, because I think you could make the argument that, if you're a team who would typically have qualified for a bowl or be on the cusp of doing so, I think you can make the case that, hey, because all these games got canceled, we're missing out on an opportunity for practice because we didn't get, some other team got picked over we did that has the same record as us. So I will be curious to see if that comes into play. I mean, can Penn State still make a bowl game? Yes. The problem, though, is that a lot of the lower tier Big Ten bowls have been canceled now. So there's already a lack of spots there compared to what there would normally be. So I would still say it's probably pretty unlikely, but even if they don't get there, Bob, I do think that you could see the development practices be allowed for any program that doesn't make a bowl game. Maybe they only get 10 instead of 15 or whatever it is. But I could see them getting some just to sort of replicate what they missed for spring practice and everything else.
Yeah, the only problem I would say, Greg, is, the Big Ten Champions Week, I believe it's the weekend of December 19th. Does that sound right? And so, a lot of these kids and a lot of these coaches have been, on campus since June. I don't know, maybe they did go home briefly, but with the holiday coming up and they're kind of just living in like a fishbowl, in a quarantine fishbowl, essentially, do you really want to try and practice, over Christmas break or Christmas week when you've kind of essentially just been up there? You haven't seen friends and family. You haven't been allowed to really do a lot of things with friends and family. I know that they didn't have a spring practice. I just wonder, what if it really makes sense to do this during a time like this? Maybe Greg, they come back and say, in the spring, we're gonna, instead of having 15 practices, you're allowed to have 25, and it's a 6 weeks or 7 weeks of spring practice. I just wonder if kids really, I think football coaches, and I think parents, and I think players, administrator staff, they've given up a lot, I think, to get this season kind of shoehorned in, and you could see it. You look around and games are still getting canceled left and right, and teams aren't playing their full allotment of games. I just wonder, maybe if Penn State would get to 4-5, do they really need to practice, and do they really want to play a game against another 4-5 team, or they just kind of want to get back to what's really important and see your family?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, Bob. I think that would be a pretty challenging task to say, okay, we got to this point. Now let's fly one night before the Cheez-It Bowl and
Yeah.
go play in that. I mean,
Yeah.
this season has been tough as it is, and I agree with you. If you're not in the playoff, if you're not even, again, the bowl experience, it's warm weather. You're supposed to be able to go out and see some different things. You're not going to be able to do any of that this year. You're going to be stuck at the hotel unless you're at practice. So, yeah, what is the point? That's a good question. And I don't think Penn State's going to have to worry about it, but there will be some teams that are, and I'll be curious to see how they handle it.
All right, Greg, before we wrap this up, we're getting very close to wrapping up this Rutgers edition of the Blue White Breakdown. Anything else strike your fancy, either from James Franklin's Tuesday press conference, or did you learn or glean any info from Greg Schiano's media session this week? And also, I'm going to ask you anyway, because you're a man that knows your way around a point spread. I know a lot of people know that about you. I know that about you. Penn State -10, early thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of them. Obviously, Schiano said that Penn State and Rutgers are not rivals at this point because the series has been a blowout so often for so long. So that was good to hear. Point spread thoughts. I mean, Penn State covered it last. I mean, honestly, I think Rutgers is just a little bit better than Michigan. I mean, at least Greg Schiano should at least have them care. I don't know if Michigan cares anymore. So I would not be quick to take the points or lay the points in this instance. I could see Penn State kind of winning the same way it did at Michigan, a 10-point game, something in that ballpark. And I don't think I'd want to lay the points. I don't know if I trust this team yet to do that. And then, James Franklin was asked, Michigan, Bob, as we talk about this on Tuesday, is going to do virtual workouts and stuff again today because they had some COVID problems out there following the Penn State game. James Franklin didn't make it sound like that has caused any problems for Penn State, but did make note of the fact that obviously this is a challenging year and that things can change pretty much at the drop of a hat. So I don't anticipate that impacting Penn State this week, but as always, we'll have to wait and see.
All right, guys, we will be back. Hopefully I'll be back on Thursday with some thoughts from David Jones, and Greg and I will be chatting. No, maybe I'll be talking with Dave on Saturday as well. I can never tell with that guy, but we will be back later this week. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.